slides to show all of you. Let me do that before I begin. Wonderful, thank you. So let me first begin by thanking all of you and saying good morning to all of you. It's late in the evening for me in California, but I'm really delighted to be here with all of you. And I'm really honored to be invited by the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs to give this talk today. It's a real special honor to be here, and I only wish that I could be in India. It's been about 2 years since basically the pandemic started since I've been able to visit, but it's a country that I hold extremely dear to my heart. My research today and the project that I will be speaking with you about is about the issue of gender diversity and the board's role in mergers and acquisitions. Um, I focus on mergers and acquisitions transactions because mergers and acquisitions transactions are some of the most important and transformational undertakings by corporations. Now, across the world, and particularly here in the United States, corporations, law firms, investment banks all state that diversity matters. But what my research shows is that when it comes to these most transformational undertakings, there's a chasm between discourse and action, and that a gender gap and a very significant gender gap persists. Now, some of the work that I have done with respect to some of the projects related to gender diversity and the role of corporate governance in mergers and acquisitions is to look specifically at the role that the central players play in M&A, and also to think about then the gender gap amongst all the various actors who are involved in M&A. And so for one of the central players, who are the law firms, the lead attorneys, one of the projects that I have undertaken is to hand collect data on their leadership. Now, I look specifically at mergers and acquisitions attorneys because they're a really important subject of study, partly because the M&A practice at any law firm is typically amongst the most prestigious, the best compensated, and the most demanding practice areas. Further, the lawyers who do M&A deals also often tend to be the leaders of their law firms, in part because they have the highest status and the highest compensation. So for those of us who do research on the gender gap, these features make M&A particularly interesting and provide us a window into the extent to which women are making it into the top echelons of leadership. And part of my research here is really driven by the premise that understanding, documenting, and disclosing the gender gap is critical for increasing accountability, but also for determining the types of solutions that may work to reduce these disparities. And the project that I'm going to talk about today and the issue of gender diversity in M&A that I'm speaking about is actually part of a much larger set of research projects that I have undertaken, some alone, some with co-authors, on persistent inequalities in corporate law and governance. So let me first talk a little bit about the importance of M&A transactions with given the experience of the members who are in this room, you're quite familiar with. Um, M&A transactions are some of the most impactful decisions that a company can take. A good transaction can greatly enhance the value of a business. It can greatly affect the strategic direction of a company. But a bad transaction, a bad deal, whether that failure is rooted in the concept, that is the logic of the deal, the business justification for the deal, whether it's rooted in the price, or whether it's the execution of the transaction, is probably the fastest legal means of destroying the company's value. Now, M&A, by any measure, has been extremely hot across the globe. So deal making in 2021 was really one that was for the record books. There were $5.5 trillion worth of M&A transactions done globally. In the United States, that um, 2021 was the most active year for mergers and acquisitions transactions. As far as I know, because I read the Indian press quite often, 2021 was also a very, very busy year for mergers and acquisitions activity in India. Many corporate boards felt pressure from either their investors or from their customer base or from their shareholders and other stakeholders to either bulk up their businesses or to slim down and focus. So if you think about companies such as General Electric or Johnson and Johnson or Toshiba, all of them announced plans to split their operations within days of each other. So generating a lot more in terms of deal making and generating obviously more fees for their advisors. Now, there's an enormous amount of empirical research that has been done on potential pitfalls in M&A deal making. And in some of my earlier scholarship, I've actually worked with one of the judges on the Delaware Chancery Court to write a paper that really kind of goes through the implications of the pitfalls of M&A deal making. But I want to talk about them a little bit today because they relate to what I'm going to talk about with respect to gender diversity and the role of the board in M&A. So the literature that explores the causes and consequences of acquisition transactions is pretty fast. Partly because, as I said, M&A is such an important part of corporate decision making. And empirical research really indicates that there are shortfalls in decision making in M&A transactions. For example, much of the empirical research finds that there's a vast amount of bidder overpayment by buyers in M&A transactions. That overpayment is particularly acute when publicly traded companies are involved in M&A transactions. And in fact, some studies seem to suggest that the losses provoke wealth destruction on an aggregate scale and not just a wealth transfer from the target company to the target company from the bidder's shareholders. Now, commentators also argue that the ramifications and the degree of failure from M&A transactions are sometimes not readily obvious. So, transaction failure can be ascribed to changes in economic conditions, unforeseen new technology, lack of, appropriate due diligence, mistakes in integrating the two businesses, and so forth. Now, one of the things that empirical scholars and a number of finance scholars have tried to do is to try and address why it is that M&A is plagued with pitfalls in decision making. Um, and the studies themselves have connected these sort of challenges with M&A decision making to sort of two, I would say, broad rubric, two sets of explanations that are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So I will call them sort of the agency cost explanations and the cognitive bias explanations. Acquisitions really highlight the conflict of interest that managers might have in running a corporation. So, studies show, for example, that in many transactions, the acquirers, managers, or their directors benefit significantly from a transaction at the expense of other stakeholders in the company. They might benefit through increased power, increased prestige, or increased compensation or compensation connected with the transaction itself. M&A, particularly for companies that are professionally managed, is an opportunity for CEO compensation renegotiation. A lot of executives receive cash and stock bonuses for completing acquisitions or for selling a company. Obviously, a lot of executives have golden parachutes that are connected with a sale of a company. And then there's sort of the element of empire building that is often involved in M&A transactions. Executives and board members might be particularly driven to do M&A deals because they want to gain greater prestige, to leave a legacy, to be seen as winners in a takeover battle if it's a takeover type transaction. Now that A second set of elements that sort of really impact M&A deal making, and then the number of studies have looked at the issues of behavioral biases in M&A, is really the different kinds of behavioral biases that drive M&A transactions. So that might include ego gratification or overconfidence about the value of a deal, or management's own overestimation of and over optimism regarding their ability to execute a deal successfully. And in fact, studies find that managers can be particularly flawed in their decision making when they have extensive social ties between buyers and sellers. For example, if they have extensive educational background similarities or employment history, social relationships. Um, M&A can also be driven by just a desire to keep up with peers. And in fact, a number of studies show that executives, for example, undertake an M&A deal when other executives who went to business school with them are also active in the M&A market. Um, and there's also this sort of a reason to think that advisors, particularly deal advisors, might be reinforcing the behavioral biases that executives have, partly because um, advisors are incentivized to uh, promote deal making by executives and by companies. Um, Now, what about the board and what's the role of the board in all of this? Because for purposes of corporate law and corporate governance, the behaviors that I just discussed really implicate the behavior of fiduciaries, right? The officers and directors of a corporation. And they raise questions about whether those fiduciaries are fulfilling their fiduciary duties. And they raise questions about the role that the board currently plays and should play in acquisitions. A central fiduciary duty of the board of directors is the protection and promotion of the interests of the corporation and its shareholders in the United States and its shareholders and its broader set of stakeholders in India, given the more stakeholder oriented nature of Indian corporate law. That involves then the board's both advisory role as well as its monitoring role. And in both of those elements, the board plays a really important decision making role when it comes to major corporate transactions, including transformative acquisitions. In virtually all significant acquisitions, some level of board involvement is the norm. So the board might not be involved in identifying, for example, acquisition targets, but once a target company has been identified and significant efforts are made to move forward with an acquisition, board members often become involved in some level of the acquisition or the transaction process. And as part of their fiduciary responsibilities, if they are voting on a transaction, directors have to undertake sufficient investigation and obtain all reasonably available information regarding the transaction. Um, and in certain jurisdictions, and certainly the United States is one of them, directors are also charged with actually voting on whether they recommend the transactions to the shareholders of the company. Now, experts also often caution, though, that despite this fiduciary responsibility that the board has, um, boards are at times a little reticent to be deeply involved in acquisitions or to challenge management's often optimistic assumptions about a deal's value. And in fact, surveys that have been done across the world of directors show that at least one third to one half believe that their board could be more involved in shaping M&A strategies and evaluating transactions that are proposed by management. Now, what does this have to do with gender disparities in M&A? I'm going to talk about that now, why this matters. Um, so the as I've just spent maybe about the last 10 minutes talking specifically about shortcomings in decision making in M&A. And so a lot of my work today is going to be talking about why gender diversity matters to addressing those shortcomings in decision making. But before I do that, I also want to make sure um, that in your sort of in to stress your appreciation for the equity and inclusion and access reasons for addressing gender disparities in mergers and acquisitions deal making. Um, Inclusion and equitable behavior is incredibly important around the globe. And from an equity standpoint, what we see now is that a significant portion of the population does not hold key decision-making roles and fundamental deals that greatly impact companies and billions of dollars trading hands. And this culture of equal opportunity is particularly important for companies and corporations. Studies show, and I'm just quoting Professor Deborah Rohde, who's a scholar on gender disparities and leadership, but part of her work is looking at studies that show that obstacles to women's success also decrease employees' morale, commitment, retention, and they increase the expenses associated with recruiting and training and mentoring replacements. The gender disparities might also be important from what I would say is instrumentalist reasons to impact M&A and M&A decision making. So there was a lot of research that has been done on the issue of decision makings, particularly when it comes to complex transactions. And as I said, lots of research suggests that M&A deals are plagued with shortcomings in decision making. So research on group decision making really suggests that greater diversity could improve M&A transactions. At its core, M&A involves many groups of sophisticated actors working together to make complex, multifaceted decisions. And these are exactly the types of decisions that research has long suggested could benefit from diverse perspectives in the room. And a large body of research by scholars suggests that the presence of differing opinions, so the sort of addressing the problem of groupthink and the presence of cognitive conflict could in fact lead to more critical discussions, consideration of more alternatives, and positively contribute to overall decision making processes. And in a larger article that I have written on gender disparities in M&A, I go through in detail the sort of the body of the finance literature that has really begun to explore the connection between M&A outcomes and the lack of diversity among the decision makers, whether those decision makers are the board members or whether they are members of the executive suite or whether they are members of the advisors in M&A transactions. One of the things that a lot of this research stresses is that when you have homogeneous groups in a room making a decision, they are prone to high levels of cohesiveness and have a lower likelihood of having meaningful critical discussion about a particular decision or a particular transaction. Um, Now, one of the things that empirical scholars have done to sort of build upon this line of work is to really then explore whether, in fact, gender diversity, whether it's on the board or whether it's among the C-suite, actually does make a difference in M&A decision making. And I want to talk about a few of the papers that have looked at this issue. Um, so the research on board diversity does seem to suggest that in fact M&A transactions benefit from having a critical mass of diverse board members in the room. And by diversity, most of this research is really focusing on gender diversity because a lot of other aspects of identity diversity are currently missing in most boardrooms. But if you look, for example, as a famous study by Adams and Ferreira in 2009 that shows that increased female board representation is significantly associated with more vigorous board monitoring and more effective board monitoring. And a number of studies have then extended that work to look specifically at mergers and acquisitions. So Levy, Lee, and Zhang in 2014, and another study by Chen, Crossland, and Huang um, show that greater female board representation is actually negatively associated with both overall firm acquisitiveness and also target acquisition size, and essentially associated with less overpayment in M&A transactions. Now, there's also starting to be some research on executive diversity and looking specifically at the CEO and the CEO role when it comes to mergers and acquisitions transactions. This research is somewhat more limited, partly because there are just not that many CEOs who are women at publicly traded companies. But what this research does seem to suggest is that women executives actually approach M&A transactions differently from male executives. Male CEOs, for example, undertake more acquisitions with worse performance and exhibit relative overconfidence in significant acquisitions compared to women CEOs. Now, why that is, and the reasons for that are particularly complicated. It might be that women CEOs have to explain the logic of their deal more. It might be that they are monitored more by the board. It might be that they are undermined more, and so they're more careful and perhaps uh, more risk averse with respect to acquisition decision making, but that still needs to get unpacked quite a bit through additional research. What is true is that despite this research that shows the benefits of diversity for decision making, one of the things that we see is that whether it is amongst the board, whether it is as financial advisors, whether it's the executives in the C suite themselves, or whether it's the legal advisors, women are vastly underrepresented in leadership positions. And I want to discuss with you all a little bit about the underrepresentation because so many of you are members of boards and are very cognizant of sort of appreciating the data on what is going on with respect to leadership positions in mergers and acquisitions. So let me first talk a little bit about, pardon me, my slides went off. Let me talk a little bit about the boardroom and kind of changes in the boardroom. Because one of the areas where there has been some improvement with respect to diversity in corporate governance and diversity amongst the players who play an important role in mergers and acquisitions has been on diversity in the board. So globally, board diversity has continued to improve when it comes to gender diversity, with an approximate average of 24% of women sitting in corporate boardrooms. This is based on a Credit Suisse report that looked at thousands of companies across the globe in 2021. In the United States, this is an area where we have seen actually fairly significant improvement with respect to board membership. Um, in 2010, only 16% of board members in the S&P 500 were women. By 2021, that number had increased actually to 30% of S&P 500 directors. And in fact, 43% of new independent directors being placed on boards in the United States and public company boards are women. And part of the reason for these changes are some of the same reasons that you see in India. Investors and legislators are increasingly expressing their attention to board diversity. So, for example, if you look at major institutional investors such as BlackRock or State Street or Vanguard, they have basically said that they will not vote for a board slate that does not include some level of gender diversity on their board. So there's a lot of investor pressure. Certain jurisdictions in the United States, such as the state of California, have actually adopted board diversity quotas that are somewhat similar to the one woman director rule that you have in the Companies Act in India or the SEBI regulation for large companies to have an independent director. And so what we're starting to see is a huge change in the makeup of boards in companies in the United States. Now, where diversity lags in companies in the US is outside of the largest companies. So if you look at the percentage of the Russell 3000, the 3,000 largest sort of publicly traded companies in the US, that 30% number really does come down to about 20%. And the Russell 3000 companies are pretty far behind the S&P 500 companies with respect to board diversity. The other place where diversity still lags is in board leadership. So women are joining boards, but they are not necessarily being placed in the board leadership level yet. Only 8% of S&P 500 independent board chairs in the US are women. That number is about 6% if you look at the Russell 3000 more generally. Only 13% of S&P 500 lead directors are women in the United States. And in India, I know that board representation and female representation on boards has increased significantly given the legislative as well as regulatory changes. So that number has increased by almost 6% from 2015, from 11.4% in 2015 to 17.3% in 2021. That still is far below the general average across the globe, but a big improvement compared to where things were. But the board, in some ways, is the easy place to address issues of particularly gender diversity. Um, Obviously, gender diversity on the board and the role of the board is something that deserves a lot of attention, and I've done a lot of my own work on issues related to the role of the board and corporate governance on the board. But there really is a risk that the singular focus on the board of directors really misses other equally and arguably for purposes of mergers and acquisitions, the more important players in decision making in M&A transactions. And so if you look at generally leadership in the corporate pipeline, and the data that I have here is for publicly traded companies in the United States. The numbers in India are clearly much lower with respect to women in the C-suite and in the executive roles. But if you look generally at women in leadership, the progress has been much more modest than the progress has been with respect to the board. So women are severely underrepresented if you look particularly in the C-suite. So if you look at the CEO role and the direct reports to the CEO in American companies, only about 24% of C-suite positions are held by women. That number is much lower when you look at women of color. Women of color in the United States, minority women, only make up about 4% of the C-suite roles. If you look at the CEO role specifically, if you look generally at the Fortune 500 companies, the 500 the largest companies in the US, women only account for 8% of Fortune 500 CEOs. That's actually a record number in the US. But if you look generally at the broader Russell 3000, women are a little under 6% of the chief executive officers in companies. That number is much lower in India, where it's only about 2%, as far as I go, my data shows. Now, even within the C-suite, though, the proportion of women in senior leadership roles really differs by role. So women are overrepresented in C-suite support functions, what some people will call sort of the pink collar roles of the C-suite. So it might be that they are the head of human resources, the head of legal, while men tend to be concentrated in operations, profit and loss centers, research and development, all which are seen as critical experiences for both the CEO role as well as for board level positions. So there's still, even within that 24% number that I'm showing you, a lot of work that is to be done with respect to women's presence in those roles. Now, if if you go beyond the senior executive officers of a company and you go beyond the board of directors and you look at the advisors, you see the same level of disparity, and you see that disparity pretty starkly. For example, if you look at the financial advisors. So financial advisors at the leadership level resemble their clients. They're dominated in the United States by white men, generally across the globe, but by men. Wall Street, for example, has never been particularly hospitable to women, and masculinity norms pervade the financial services industry. M&A advisory work, especially for the largest M&A types of transactions, has long been male dominated. That's true across the globe. Women make up less than 15% of senior leaders in investment banking, but even that number tends to be quite misleading. So if you dig into the information on large advisory firms, you see that very few women show up. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Catalyst Partners, which is a leading technology focused boutique investment bank that has advised on basically almost all of the large tech related mergers and acquisitions transactions, has among its 24 top senior leadership team only one woman. That's actually the firm's general counsel, and it does not include any of their senior financial advisors or any of their senior investment bankers. The numbers are slightly better at some of the larger independent advisory firms, such as Moelis and Company, according to data that they have released. They strongly stress their commitment to diversity and inclusion, but women represent approximately 9% of the people identified as part of the firm's senior team, and that is across Moelis's business around the globe. Now, as I had said earlier, for one group of the advisors, one of the major players in my project, I dive into the data more specifically, and I hand collected all of this data for basically the top 100 largest transactions involving publicly traded companies in the United States in each year from 2014 to 2020 to try and evaluate leadership on the deal. Now, the reason I was able to get this data, some people are interested in how I was able to find the data, is anytime you have a large transaction that involves a publicly traded company in the United States, that acquisition agreement has to be filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission of the US. And then that acquisition agreement is then publicly available to everybody. And within the acquisition agreement, there is in fact a section, it's called the notice provision, that basically lists who are the lead lawyers on the transaction. And in fact, an important indicator of status, power, and compensation in major law firms, particularly in M&A groups, is whether one gets listed as a leader on the transaction. And so I practiced mergers and acquisitions for about 7 years at a leading law firm, and I knew where to look. And so what I was able to do is gather this information from the data that is on the agreements. I also then gathered and collected data from the press releases that were issued in connection with the transactions, as well as other information from the law firm's own websites and each lawyer's professional biographies. And what this analysis reveals is that 30 years after women have begun to account for almost half of all law students and basically half of all entry level lawyers, leadership in lags far behind with respect to gender parity. So if you look at this figure one that I am showing to all of you, one of the things that you could see is that women's representation as lead corporate lawyer really varies from year to year, but it remains quite low. And as lead counsel for the buyer, for example, there doesn't seem to be any kind of a linear pattern of increased or decreased representation of women in lead counsel positions during that time period, but it hovers at an average of about 10.5% during the time period. There's a slight uptick, increase in the share of women as the lead lawyers for the selling company, for the target company, particularly since 2017. Now, this This data itself is actually lower than what law firms report generally with respect to the number of women that they have as partners. So, in general, the reporting by the law firms that is done to the American Bar Association indicates that women make up 25% of all partners at large law firms. But what the data from my study really seems to emphasize is that even within the large law firms, inequality reigns within the partner ranks, with men holding the power, prestige, and pay in the largest and most important transactions. Now, a lot of the law firms really tout their commitment to diversity. And so, one of the other things I was able to do with the data gathering that I was doing for this project is to then dive into the very largest law firms that advise on these types of transactions. 146 law firms were involved in in the 700 deals that I studied from 2014 to 2020. But the majority of these law firms appeared in less than 10 transactions. Now, the top 20 law firms over this period are the ones that are listed. I've got the top 10, and then in the next slide, I will show you the other numbers 11 through 20. And what you can see from this data is that the predominance of men as lead counsel is not driven by one law firm alone. Other than actually at one law firm in my data set, which is a California firm called Cooley, men appear as lead counsel in much higher numbers than women. Um, uh, and the discrepancy with respect to men and women is particularly pronounced at the top 10 law firms advising on the greatest number of transactions. So if you look, for example, at the leading law firm for M&A in the United States, Wachtell Lipton, they're only actually, women only appear 13 times over the entire 7-year period, and that's only 6 women that have advised on the transaction in the study. And that's compared to 40 men that held basically 299 rules in advising on M&A transactions. Um, at some of the very leading law firms that sort of tout their commitment to diversity, you see very, very few women in lead counsel positions. So I'll take two examples of the ones that really stand out. In the top 10, for example, Davis Polk and Wardwell, which is very well known as a leading international counsel on M&A deals. It named only 2 women to lead counsel positions during the entire period between 2014 and 2020, compared to 81 men, respectively, during that time period. Or another firm that's sort of well known as an international firm, Clary Gottlieb, named a total of 2 women compared to all of the men that were named, the 66 men that were named during that time period. So as you can see through this data, there's very little uh, in terms of disparities in some ways of the gender disparities at the various law firms. And if you look kind of more generally, one of the things that you'll see through the data is what is changing is that the percent of deal teams that include at least one woman named is increasing, particularly if you look generally between 2014 to 2020. So in 2014, around 19% of deal teams included a woman as at least one named lead partner. This number rose to 30% in 2020. It was fairly uncommon within the data that I was gathering on the deals for there to only be one partner named. It was usually more than one. Pardon me. But if there was one named, it was almost always a man. The number of deal teams, sort of in terms of senior leadership, where women were named as lead counsel, was incredibly small during this time period at basically below 5% of all of the transactions in the data set. I have a lot more data that I discuss in the longer paper with respect to all of this, but one of the other things that I observed in the data is that there was a much greater likelihood for the same man to be staffed on deals repeatedly throughout the years. Um, and that was true beyond lawyers representing, clients who do multiple types of transactions. So in the US, like a company like Comcast, or in India, like a company like Reliance. Um, but generally, most of the women that I saw on the data set only advised on one transaction and not multiple transactions. Within my larger project, I look at also where sort of disparities lie and even training, whether it comes to executives and whether it comes to the lawyers. So I look specifically at the gender disparities amongst the faculty at major business schools, which tend to have only about 20%, 25% of their tenured faculty as women, with very few of them actually teaching the core finance type of courses. And I look specifically at the law schools as well, given my role in a law school and my dean role in a law school. And I see the same kind of disparities within the legal profession and training of lawyers. Women rarely constitute a majority of law professors, and particularly corporate law professors at the largest law schools in the US. So if I look at the top 50 law schools, at many of those schools, there is a very small percentage of their faculty, and particularly of their senior tenured faculty, are women. So if you look specifically at Harvard Law School, only one woman out of 11 faculty members is sort of even included within their corporate law curriculum, and she's actually not a lawyer, she's an economist who teaches a seminar. Or if you look at Columbia Law School, there are 4 women identified out of 21 faculty members who teach corporate law. Same thing if you gather data on mergers and acquisitions and sort of finance related and M&A related classes at the top 50 law schools. So I was able to gather data from 2 years of instruction at the top 50 law schools. And one of the things I saw is that even amongst the faculty who were teaching, including adjunct faculty, women constituted less than 15% of all faculty teaching classes in mergers and acquisitions. So, what are some solutions for these disparities, and what are some of the pressures that both companies are facing, uh, as well as sort of the banks and the advisors generally. And I think you see the sort of the pressures and the solutions coming from a variety of different angles. So here I've got a picture of the State Street's um, fierce girl on Wall Street. So a lot of institutional investors are now demanding lots of information beyond just board diversity, and you're seeing a real push in the United States towards companies having to disclose actually the diversity, gender diversity, and otherwise racial diversity as well of their executive teams generally, or all of their senior leadership teams, or their entire workforce. And that is coming out pretty aggressively. You're seeing sort of major private equity firms announcing that they are going to, for example, link their credit facilities to board diversity. So Carlyle announced that late last year. You're seeing companies and companies' general counsels, issuing ultimatums to law firms, saying essentially, we will not refer our business or our transactions to you without you presenting to us a diverse team. You're seeing the development of new kinds of investment banks. So, for example, just earlier this year, there was the announcement that Lazard, which is sort of one of the better known investment banks, was going to actually invest in a brand new financial advisory firm, a brand new sort of an M&A investment banking firm called Independence Point Partners, which is started by actually the former chairwoman of global banking at Bank of America, that is actually going to ensure that their leadership is composed of both women and people of color, and to have that be different from what we're seeing generally in leadership at the large investment banks thus far. So with that, I will finish up here, and I invite your questions and your comments, and I'd be happy to share any of this research with you if you wanted to get in touch with me. I'm very excited to hear the perspective of all of you, particularly independent directors, as I know that many of you care about these issues enormously. So thank you very much, and I'll stop right there.
Great. Uh, that's wonderful, uh, Professor Afra, having your insights very well researched. Friends, can we have questions now? You can raise hands.
Yeah, I mean,
Amar, can you help us on this?
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
we
So
have Dr.
I'll make
Uh,
presenter.
Subramanian Vaidya. Do you have a question? I can see Miss Simpi Khandelwal. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. Hello, ma'am. Good evening. Uh, I have a question. Hello.
Yeah, yeah. Please go ahead. We can
Yeah,
hear you.
yeah. Can gender diversity help in avoiding costly acquisitions and how?
Yes, so that's one of the things that I was talking about earlier. I mean, one of the things that research has shown is actually having a more gender diverse board does impact the both bad decision making in acquisitions and reduces costly acquisitions. And one of the reasons for that scholars have hypothesized based on research that has been done on group decision making is the fact that when you have identity diversity in the boardroom, so for example, when you have a critical mass of women, there is more discussion, there's somewhat more preparation for board meetings, there is more opportunity for questions and answers, and a little bit more pushing of management and sort of management's assumptions about a transaction. And so, I cite to several studies that have been done that look specifically at how women directors um, request and seek more information with respect to acquisition transactions. And that seems to clamp down on costly or overly costly acquisitions.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Miss. This is Ravi Kumar. Uh, I have been on board for last 2 decades, and I have been in several mergers and acquisitions. And when we look at a merger and acquisition transaction, we primarily look at one aspect, which is it beneficial for the stakeholders, particularly shareholders, the employees, and the customers. There is an external event which is not in the legal structure in India, and I think it is so in US also, whether the transaction is beneficially impacting competition in the market. If you see recent sale by SoftBank of UK-based, Cambridge-based ARM semiconductor company to NVIDIA, it had to be cancelled because the companies involved approved it, but the regulators felt that there was going to be a dominant market position. And in all these transactions, what I felt was the relevant skill sets needed were whether these are beneficial for the stakeholders. And actually, it needed diversity in board in regard to experience and not necessarily by gender. It could be all women, it could be all men. How do you?
I think that's a really interesting point, but here's where I sort of, I guess, push back a little bit on your I guess premise, which is diversity of identity often then involves diversity of experience. A lot of women moving up to the board position have come through different kinds of professional backgrounds, and so are asking different kinds of questions. If you look specifically, for example, at companies' performance on ESG issues and with respect to stakeholders, companies seem to perform better on those metrics when they have a more diverse board. So diversity of experience is important, but diversity of identity and experience often go hand in hand.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Pritha, if you can go ahead with your question.
Right, right. Thank you. Prof. Afra, that was a wonderful presentation. I mean, my name is Preetha. I'm an independent director. I just wanted to check, and you've done a fair amount of research and across domains and across industries. What would you say is the capability requirements that women particularly need to have, so that there is, like, it doesn't have to be just only from an affirmative action point of view and looking at data, but on their own merit, also they get it. So what capability requirements do you think women particularly need to gain competence, and what can independent directors do to ensure the companies do that proactively to develop more women?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I'd say two things in response to that. One is one of the things that the research has shown is when you're adding women board members, you're not adding them for reasons of, I would say, affirmative action. So let me give you an example. When California passed its 2018 legislation requiring that companies basically add women to their boards, the women that were added to the board were actually, on average, more experienced, more credentialed than generally the average man that was getting added to boards. So what we're seeing generally is that the women who are being added to boards are ones with really deep experience. Now, that experience can come in a lot of different ways. I think one of the things that's important is to gain experience in terms of leadership positions in different sectors or in different environments, whether that's leadership that is coming from academia, whether that's leadership that's coming from doing consulting work, whether that is leadership from being an accountant. There are a lot of different places where boards are now drawing board members from that they maybe hadn't looked to before, because they didn't have to think about the issue of diversity, and they could get the guy that they knew from their last company, or somebody that they played golf with. In the US, people play golf, maybe in India, who they played cricket with. But one of the things that you're seeing is, as they're adding these diverse board members because the quotas are being put into place, the people that they're bringing in are actually extremely talented. So I'll give you an example. A woman that has recently been added to a couple of companies in the biotech sector in the United States is a chair of a department at MIT. That woman is coming in with a level of understanding of physics that most of the men in that room and it involves their business, that most of the men in that room don't have. She's not
Wow.
necessarily someone that would have been tapped for an independent director position, because companies weren't forced to look outside of the box before this. But I think there are a lot of different kinds of skill sets that everyone can gain. I have been in leadership positions now at the university for a number of years, and that has involved then leadership training, finance training, human resource management training, sustainability training, all of that kind of training that can make you, I think, a well-rounded board member. And the thing that I think is interesting is we're asking, demanding all this for the women board members as they're getting added. Certainly, we're seeing that in the United States. We never asked and requested this from the male board members, right?
Interesting.
So it wasn't like we ever said, oh, like, what kind of training are the men getting to come into this room? We never really asked that question, right? But a lot of the women board members that have been added to boards, and if you look at the studies that have been done, have similar credentials, if not better credentials.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. Can I come in, please?
Yeah, Mr. Vaidya. Yeah, Mr. Vaidya, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah. See, it seems after your discussion on the presentation, I noticed that inherently the women who are very, very talented, they come on board. But what about those women who are interested in coming into the mainstream? Uh, are there any templates or SOP in terms of handheld grooming of them so that they can come to the advisory levels and then later on onto the board? Uh, do we have any templates like this in any of the countries when it comes to women being groomed in that position to come up to
That's
that
a
level of gender diversity? Yeah.
No, I think that's a great question because I think one of the things that's really critical in some of the work that is being done right now in the United States, because we have a lot of work to do on this, is actually starting to groom women, starting at sort of the middle management level, to then try and ensure that they are not necessarily, that they're getting tracked into different aspects of the business of the company so that they can become, so that they can go down that path of becoming board members eventually. So, for example, ensuring that women are becoming have P&L responsibilities or profit and loss center responsibilities, or that they have responsibilities for research and development or for business development and different kind of areas which can then help groom them eventually to become board members. This is one of the reasons why, for example, right now institutional investors in the United States are asking for companies' data with respect to diversity beyond just the senior management team and beyond just the board. Because what they want to see is what is the kind of work that is being done to groom people for leadership at a much earlier level than right before you become a
Correct.
board member.
Right. 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 Thank you. Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Yeah, good evening, Professor Afsharipour. I'm Sabarish, and I'm also an independent director. I did peruse your slides on the disparity in gender diversity in top law firms that deal with M&A. Of course, my internet was down for a couple of minutes, so I missed some of the following slides. My question to you is this disparity because these law firms don't encourage women professionals, or there are less number of women who are specializing in M&A in law? I would be happy to listen to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what is interesting is if you look at women entering the field of M&A, it's somewhat lower than general sort of entering the field of law. So about 50% of associates are women generally right now at the large elite law firms. The number that enter a field like M&A is slightly lower than that. It's in the mid 40s. But then when you look at the leadership level, it falls down pretty significantly. And I've now been doing a lot of interviews and meetings with lawyers at the top law firms. And one of the things that they say is that the reason why then you see this sort of leak in the pipeline from the associate level to the more senior level is really for a whole host of reasons, but both a combination of sort of biases against women as negotiators and as lawyers and so forth, but also because the networking and the opportunities for networking and mentoring are much, much less for the women attorneys. And so that becomes both very discouraging, but also impedes their ability to kind of build the type of client relationship they need to then become leaders in the field.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Jain, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Yeah, madam, thanks a lot for sharing very interesting data about the disparity of women and men. In one of the slides, you have said that the male CEOs take more acquisitions, but with the worse performance, right? And they exhibit relatively overconfidence in comparison to women CEOs. So, just I want to understand this is the overall scenario in USA, or it's a scenario across the world, and what is the reasons behind it? I mean, there is a increase in numbers nowadays. Women participation is increasing, but ultimately it remains at a low level, whatever level we call it. So can you elaborate further on this, that what are the different strategies or the efforts which are being taken? Because ultimately every country wants that there has to be increased level of participation in board rooms, or for that matter in any other important decisions taking. Please elaborate on this.
Thanks so much for your question, Mr. Giant. So the studies that have been done that look specifically at the performance between male CEOs and women CEOs are studies that have been done of companies, transactions that have been done by US companies and UK companies. Part of the reason for that is because there's a lot more data and disclosure with respect to those companies, and you can then track the performance of the transactions much more. Part of it is also because there's a lot more required disclosure in connection with the transaction. When you do deals, for example, if you're a public company in the US, you have to file every single PowerPoint presentation that you make to your shareholders with respect to the deal. And so one of the ways that they can measure overconfidence is through the use of the language that CEOs use, to then determine sort of who's exhibiting more overconfidence with respect to a transaction. So as far as I know, I have not seen any studies that have been done of companies in India that sort of measure the difference in the performance. I think sometimes that might be hard to do because you have so few women CEOs at sort of large publicly traded, publicly listed Indian companies. And the reasons for why that overconfidence exists are complex. So a lot of sociologists have been doing a lot of work on the role of masculinities in the C-suite generally and in the CEO role, and sort of in who, particularly here in the West and in the United States, what we think leadership traits are. And a lot of times, actually, we over select for the CEO position people who are overconfident because that's our inclination of that must be who a leader is. So I'll take an example, Donald Trump, right? People who are overconfident compared to their abilities tend to be people who actually get selected for CEO positions in the US. So those sorts of traits are things that we sort of select for, even though those traits are not necessarily then tied to better corporate performance. And a number of psychologists have done studies of sort of watching CEO press releases and interviews and so forth to sort of measure for words that demonstrate overconfidence.
Yeah, thank you very much, madam. Just for India, I can say, looking to the lower participation as of now, now there is an increasing stress that at least in the board constitution, there has to be one woman director,
Yes.
maybe independent or otherwise. So that way, India is also progressing to increase the number and the participation of the women director and that higher levels in the board. That is there, madam, now. Thank you.
Yes,
Thanks
yeah,
a
I
lot.
have a book chapter I wrote about that. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Joshi, would you like to come in?
Yeah, good morning. Very informative session. I have one, means I was going through your slides and the major comparison what you have given in your presentation, that India stands around say 17.3%, right, in women participation in the suits, right? But the major comparison you have made with the developed countries. I would like to know if you have some status that where India stands, right, for the developing countries rather than developed countries.
So I think that's a great question. So generally, I mean, I think with respect to the developing countries, there's just much less out there with respect to information. But if you look at the graphs that have been done with respect to kind of generally, India is sort of right in the middle of where some of the other developing where some of the other developing countries are. So if you look at the type of work and the data that has been selected by Credit Suisse, which looked at a whole host of countries, India does better than some developed countries, such as, for example, Japan, which doesn't do as well, but not as well as some of the other sort of East Asian countries. Certainly does better than a number of countries in Africa, but not as well as uh, companies in China, for example.
So
And the
can
U.S., I
we
would
say,
say, has generally not done as well compared to some of the other developed economies.
yeah, can we say that India is top among the developing countries?
No, I don't think you can say that based on the information that is out there, that it's top amongst the developing countries. I think it's sort of right in the middle, actually.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but it's improving, quickly. I think between both the Companies Act legislation with the one woman director mandate and then the SEBI requirements as well to have an independent director that is a woman, what you're seeing is actually a pretty big shift in the number of women on boards in Indian boards. I think where you're not seeing a shift right now, based on at least the last set of studies that have come out on board diversity in India, is the women who are getting added to the board are not being placed on the most powerful board committee positions yet. So they're not generally not on the nominating and corporate governance committee, and generally not being added to the audit committee.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Uh, are there any more questions, friends? Any more questions before we close?
So I can't see any raised hands. So if someone
Right.
has any question, please raise your hands. Otherwise, yeah.
I think there are no more questions. So thank you so much, Professor Afra, for such insightful, very well researched, and it's great to hear your perspectives, which are purely based on empirical data and the kind of research. It's always pleasure following your research, which I personally keep on reading and learning from. And I personally enjoyed the talk and your insights and patiently handling the questions from the participants. Just a brief, I'm sure you must have followed. Independent Directors Data Bank is our new initiative, which we have taken in December 2019, and now we have about 25,000 directors. It also provides opportunities to the companies, because having any such representative database of profiles available to the companies for finding the people of the right skill, not just based on gender, was a big gap which we have tried to address. And I'm happy to share there are more than 2,000 companies who are searching profiles, and many of them have hired male as well as female directors. So it's really interesting. We look forward for your associations in future as well. And many thanks for stretching yourself and speaking to us at such an odd hour at your end. So thank you. I must say good night and a good sleep. Take care of yourself. Dear
Thank
friends,
you
here
very
we
much. This
close.
was a pleasure.
Yeah, friends, we close here and look forward for our next announcement with a distinguished speaker again talking on a different issue. Thank you so much. Please stay safe and take care. Bye bye.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everyone.